Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, the world of Octavia E. Butler. We're just letting participants in from the waiting room now, and we'll be getting started shortly, so we appreciate your patience. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program. We're going to be getting started just in a moment or two. We're letting folks in from the waiting room, so we appreciate your patience, and we'll be back shortly. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. It is just a few minutes past 5 o'clock, and I think we're going to get started here. Participants can join us in progress, which I expect they will do. So, good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, the world of Octavia E. Butler. This is a live online conversation between Louise Steinman and Lynell George. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. Tonight, we have more than 135 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. And oftentimes we do this with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. We simply cannot do the work we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenters. The program, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, the world of Octavia E. Butler. It's in conversation with Louise Steinman and Lynell George. Lynell George is an LA-based journalist and essayist. She has been a staff writer for both the Los Angeles Times and the LA Weekly, focusing on social issues, human behavior, the visual arts, music, and literature. Her arts and culture writing has been featured on KCET's Artbound and KPCC's The Frame. She is the author of No Crystal Stair, African Americans in the City of Angels, a collection of features and essays drawn from her reporting, and After Image, Los Angeles Outside the Frame. She won a 2017 Grammy for her liner notes on Otis Redding Live at the Whiskey A Go-Go, and is a 2020 recipient of a Distinguished Journalist Award from the Society of Professional Journalists, Los Angeles. A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World of Octavia E. Butler is her latest book. Louise Steinman is a writer, artist, and literary curator. Her work frequently deals with memory, history, and reconciliation. Her essays and feature articles have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Los Angeles Times Magazine, New York Times Syndicate, LA Weekly, Los Angeles Magazine, Salon.com, Washington Post, and many other publications. Now, tonight, Louise Steinman and Lynell George will be discussing A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World of Octavia E. Butler. And this book offers a blueprint for a creative life from the perspective of award-winning science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler. It's a collection of ideas about how to look, listen, breathe, how to be in the world. In the book, Lynell George not only engages the world that shaped Octavia E. Butler, she also explores the very specific processes through which Butler shaped herself. So tonight, if you have any questions for our presenters, please use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate the questions from the Q&A. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Lynell George and Louise Steinman and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Louise and Lynell, it is all yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here, and it seems like a really appropriate setting to talk about Octavia and with a group that so loves books, because she was such a maven of books, right, Lynell?
Absolutely. It was books were her escape and yeah, her other world.
Many other worlds.
Many other worlds.
Many other worlds. Now, one of the things your book addresses, asks, its central question, perhaps among many, is just how did Octavia Butler become Octavia E. Butler? I mean, how, and to really appreciate the full flavor of that, I'm sure some of our listeners already know Octavia's work. Some of them maybe introduced to her via this book. So just to start out, do you want to just tell us a little bit what she's known for as we go into looking at, how she became herself?
Well, Octavia E. Butler was born here in Southern California in Pasadena, and her work reflects that. She went on from very modest beginnings to become a MacArthur Genius. She was the first science fiction writer ever to win a MacArthur. She also won a Nebula and a Hugo Award for her work in science fiction. And if you had told Octavia at a very young age that she would have achieved all of this, she would have thought, I'm not so sure, but I'm certainly going to try for that. Her work has grown even in the years since she's been gone, in more than a decade. And she continues to inspire and, forge a path for people who are doing non-traditional work in settings where they are breaking barriers and breaking through glass ceilings.
That's really great. She died in 2006. I think she fell and hit her head. She was only 56,
58, and the anniversary is this week. It's Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I've been very much thinking about her.
Will you visit her grave again?
I probably will go. Yeah,
it will go. So she died in 2006, and the archive came to the Huntington in 2008. Is that right?
correct.
So describe for us when you first encounter this archive. I mean, what is this archive? Is it neatly arranged? Is it in, is it already codified? What are you dealing with when you first start tangling with it?
Such a great question. One of the things, before I even got into the archive, a friend of mine who was working in the archive sent me the finding aid. And so it was just a file, a computer file, but it was hundreds of pages long. And I'm scrolling through and thinking I don't know how to wrap my brain around this. This is so abstract. And so I started doing little searches, and I thought, well, instead of overwhelming myself by trying to do it this way, let me go into the archive and see what that's going to be. So the physical finding aid is like this big, and at first I was just really overwhelmed, just because they're boxes, and the way it's arranged. Natalie Russell is the curator who organized it all for us. She divided it, or she's broke it up into, there's manuscripts and letters and diaries, but there's so much ephemera, and that has been like, that to me was the place that I got lost in, all of the things she
got lost, where you got lost. It seems like those were your keys.
Well, yes, they were eventually, but there were days I was just going down a rabbit hole. But I'm like, this is so great, but she saved everything. She was obsessed with the news. She called herself a news junkie. And so to go in there and to see all of these yellowed LA Times clips, that she had hand cut, made notes, in the margins. They're university bulletins, that she kept, her old yearbooks. There's pencils and pens and her bills.
What is this? What is this?
That's the magic notebook. That's her pink notebook, and that's those one of the notebooks that she used to write her fiction in. And she would put a ream of paper in it and just get lost and find herself.
So I just want people to see this beautiful book. Mine is full of postmarks, because it's the ephemera. I mean, it gives the flavor of this book because you let these objects speak. And I was very touched in the beginning, rereading your introduction, about how you really started to let the objects themselves speak to you. What did they want to say? Could you talk about that process a little bit?
Absolutely. When I was starting to write, I was commissioned to do a piece that was for Clock Shop, a nonprofit here in Southern California, arts nonprofit. And the piece that I was pitched to do was to do a posthumous interview. I had no idea what that was going to look like or sound like or feel like. But once I got into the archive, again, back to being overwhelmed because there was all this stuff, like I had to think as a reporter, voice of hers do I want? Don't want the formal voice. I don't want the polished characters, from her novels. I don't even really want her essays. I want something raw. So I started with the diaries, and I started with she had different kinds of diaries, her childhood diaries. And then there are these things she called her session books, where she worked out problems later in life up into adulthood. And then there were letters, but then it was the marginalia. And once I started to kind of peel back all of the layers of Octavia's, and there were many Octavias, I started to hear her asking questions of herself every day and answering them in different ways. So that's what led me, and I just decided it's that thing that I do as a reporter all the time, is I try really hard, if we have the time, put the notes away and let what hits you become the frame for your story. And so that's what I actually did.
You've also, that's great. You've also just kind of defined two really important overlaps in terms of you being the writer chosen for this project, or the project that choosing you as its writer. Another way, one of which is just, you understand so much the struggle of what it takes to commit to writing, to what it means to try and earn your living as a writer, not as part of an institution, but to get out there with your ideas, and when you say, for someone trying to attempt the impossible,
yes.
So your own relationship to that helps to form the material, and as well geographically, you are so attuned to Southern California, to those mountains that
Yes.
Octavia looked up at, to those streets. So I want to talk a little bit about what her neighborhood looked like and what her childhood looked like there.
Octavia was actually, she grew up in the neighborhood I now live in, and I had no idea until I got into the archive and started looking at these addresses that were, you know, the return address on an envelope, or where the bills were coming. And actually I can walk to one of her homes from where I'm sitting right now. So serendipity, you know, entirely, totally serendipity. And that allowed me also, as I was reading through, you know, and she's describing, say, her childhood playground or where she's going to the library that day, I can see it. The other thing is she was a walker and a hiker. And so, and that also really informs the books, the backdrop of the books. She would take walks and record how things were growing. She was really attuned with climate. So she would measure, you know, the differences. So I see all of this sense of place she's absorbing, you know. So both urban, because, you know, it's a working class city neighborhood, but also in a few minutes you can be up in the wilderness. And that mix is so vivid in her books too. And she made it come alive. And you can see, I mean, she wrote about both experiences, you know, in her journals, in her daily little, you know, walk thought notebooks.
So both the environment, which her later work as an adult, you know, would address, I mean, the climate, you know, what the environment was doing. So her attunement to the local, in a sense, was her springboard to, you know, really thinking cosmically, really thinking in a planetary way. And also, we should mention, you know, her mother, about her parents. She was an only child.
Yes.
Her mother was a maid.
Yes.
And she saw the humiliation that her mother endured.
Yes.
And could you talk about that a little bit and how that might play into some of the choices she makes later in terms of her subject matter?
Absolutely. And it shows up in the diaries a lot. Her mom would go to work. Sometimes she was a live-in domestic. Sometimes, you know, it was just a day work. And she would see how hard her mother was working and how people treated her or looked through her. And she also was looking at the way other people in the family were being treated in their jobs, working hard. And her family came from Louisiana. They're a part of the Great Migration. They came out to California to achieve a dream. You know, it wasn't supposed to be as hard here. You know, this is the dream. Dream big, and this is what you'll get. And she saw how hard her mom was struggling, and she kept thinking, is that what I'm supposed to go to school to do? Like, and there's this one place in her diary where she's talking about how people are telling her, you know, don't be a writer. What are you doing? You need to get a job. You need to, like, think about, you know, the future. And this is love. You know, this is their way of saying, you know, we don't want you to just float off the end of the planet and not have any support or any way to take care of yourself. But at the same time, she saw that their everyday life was misery, and she didn't want to live that way. And so she was willing to bet on herself to see if there was.
And even though her mother worried about those, you know, those same things out of love, her mother gave her an amazing gift. Her mother bought her
A typewriter.
A Remington portable typewriter.
Remington portable typewriter.
No, I want that typewriter.
I know. And she was 10, you know, and people kept saying, that's a crazy expense. You know, you need food on the table and shoes. And she said, no, this is what she wanted. And she adored it. They kept thinking, oh, she'll be done with it and tired of it and she won't use it. And of course it became the vehicle.
She'll outgrow it, like her obsession with horses.
Exactly.
Which she didn't.
She didn't either.
She didn't either. To give people a kind of flavor of your beautiful writing in the book, I wonder if you could read a passage on page 32, which gives us a little sense of how these journals fit into the making of Octavia E. Butler.
All right. Just as some children make a tent out of 2 chairs and a blanket, Estelle crawls inside the pages of a journal. She is amassing a small collection of cast-off recycled diaries, most scooped up from the waste bin by her mother in one of her domestic jobs. Estelle sits in the quiet of the house, away from her mother's hymns and Bible verses, away from the noise of the children playing outside, opens a diary cover. She clicks on the radio, tunes the band to 93 KHJ, lets pop songs settle her mood. She comes here to these pages especially to do and say the things she can't express out loud. Sometimes it's best, she acknowledges in these pages, to keep things to herself, the tangents, the open questions, the most outlandish of notions, feelings and beings and visualizations. She is learning, belated as it may be, but there is still time to change. I want to go and go and go, she confides on the page. I want to take part. Her quietness, her shyness were so often misunderstood, taken for slowness, for ignorance, for laziness. Finding words for her feelings makes her aware that the wear and tear on her spirit doesn't just come from trying and then coming up short. Weariness and weariness is a result of being corrected again and again, so sternly overcorrected that you just don't bother. You just go deeper into yourself. Sometimes in her journals, she attempts to see what others might see. She gleans that she is perceived as someone who can't be penetrated, someone who floats at the edges of her small world periphery. Estelle wanders that territory. She claims it and decides to work it as if it were her own new province. That bridge from here to there, out of childhood into adolescence, is precarious. It feels so flimsy. It tosses around in the flurries of yearning and peer pressure and uncertainty. There are long stretches, hours into days, when Estelle thinks she might not make it. She is, she realizes, beyond explanation. Words and the world haven't yet caught up to her. Maybe they won't at all. People can't imagine what she sees right in this moment, in the here and now. Imagining fantasy worlds, inside out worlds, is a form of survival. At least she could reach for a time or a backdrop that might be more accommodating, one where she may be able to thrive, a place where she could just be and dream, a place that is hers and hers alone. Not the diary where she pours out her heart. That's for later. That's for a different part of her head, for her vexing and her planning and her shoring up. There is another place, self-made, to dream.
Yeah, it's such an encapsulation of her becoming. I love that passage because when you talk about her being on the periphery, wandering the territory of the periphery, I mean, you have to picture her too. So she's very tall, she's awkward looking. She's not at ease, I think, in her body among other kids. But it gives her this sense of privacy as she's kind of pushed into her own. Do you agree with that? I mean, that's kind of part of her specialness, her special powers, right?
Yes. And it's interesting. I went down to visit just recently her middle school and spoke to the principal there. And they've just named the library after her. And so they're doing all these things, and if not for COVID, and there will be a special event. But in talking to the principal, she said that some of the parents, their kids and grandparents, they knew Octavia in school.
Wow.
And that's how they describe her, that they knew she was brilliant. She was different. She stood off to the side. So it was so interesting to hear this from these anecdotes from people who brushed up against her, saw something, but knew she was holding back and holding it in to protect herself.
That's so plays into her, that sense of hers that the past is in the present, the present's in the past, the people in the school, she's still has her footprint,
Yes.
is still in that school. She made so many, one of her lists makes me think of mentioning shoes. There's I think a shoe receipt from a store for big shoes and
tall girl shoes.
Tall girl shoes.
I love it.
And I was thinking if you were, it's so there's such a poignancy and an irony of this book releasing into a pandemic, into our dystopian world. I was listening to that wonderful podcast you referred me to about Octavia. Maybe we can give that link in the chat. But hearing Octavia's voice say, I think of the 1960s as when we were trying to come together.
Yes.
The 1990s is when it was coming apart. And the 2020s, well, things will be just much worse.
Yes. Yes.
Things
will just be much worse. Yeah, the 90s were the burn, and now this, like, oh my God.
Right. And so I was thinking if like among the things, around your house, Lynell, like if you were just like, what kind of lists or ephemera of this time do you think if someone looking back would tell them, what it was like for Lynell George to live through this time? Can you think of any?
Wow, what a great question. A pile of face masks. I've talked to friends who said they're gonna burn theirs. I'm like, no, I'm not burning mine. I have a huge pile now of mail. I've been doing pen pals with people who just live not very far, East LA, Silver Lake. And I owe you a letter. I owe you two, actually. Some in New Orleans and, some, but close to home because those are going to stay with me. They matter so much because we're talking about things we would never have thought we would have talked about. I think some of my shopping lists, which are really odd, I was like looking at some of the things I've been buying in bulk and not the things that one would think, like huge things of coffee, like 2-pound bags of coffee that which I accidentally bought, but I ended up gifting to a friend last week for a Mardi Gras present.
That's a very nice one. And here we're in, she wrote about, changes in health and pandemics. And I mean, It's like, how did she know all this was coming? And at this time, after relative obscurity, she's on the New York Times bestseller list. She's a Library of America volume is coming out of her work. I mean, could you talk a little bit about why people are more drawn to her now, or what you think this explosion of interest in her, where it comes from? Has it been building steadily, or is it accelerated now?
It's definitely been building steadily. She is accelerated now. I mean, I'm so glad that she lived to see people laud her and think, even though I could see in person, sometimes that made her uncomfortable, being put up on a pedestal. But I'm so glad that she lived to see that she was important and people referenced her work, and she was flying all over the place to speak, and read. But I think there are two things. One, it appears, I think, when people look at the page and think, my gosh, she was so prescient. She saw all this coming. But she would say, you just have to pay attention. I've just been paying attention. And she wanted people to pay attention. And I think there's something in the work that, as much as it seems, and she didn't want people to think of it as like this terrible, warning, I told you so. She really wanted it to push us into fixing things, being more active, connecting. There's hope in that, community building.
To think
Learning,
about the kind of world you want. I mean, that's her
yeah,
words.
what do you want to live in? Who do you want to be around? Who do you want to make? So this idea of found family, that's a really huge part of her work. And I see that. So I see, as younger people in particular are finding this is what they're seeing. I'm going to knit my community and who I want to be around and how I want my community to look.
Mm, mm. That's really amazing to think about that way she's kind of seeded, this larger community. When you talk about, we're talking about the pace of things, I was thinking of, you're talking about slowing down time, like when you're moving through the archive, you wanted to give a sense of taking us through the archive. And then also there's that beautiful metaphor of Octavia. I had invited, we know that she was a bus rider. Like when I invited her to be a speaker on a series at the Central Library, she rode the bus there that day. She rode the bus there the day that the fire started at the Central Library. I wonder if you could read that beautiful passage about what the library meant to her. I think it starts on 104.
Okay. The library is a palace. The library is a place to sound out syllables into words into sentences, but also it is a place to sound out desires, wild notions. The library quickly becomes a hideaway, a respite from the push and pull of the world, of a world indifferent, at best combative, at worst, of a world indifferent at best, combative at worst. It is a way to learn to read. It provides unexpected contours to her long and sometimes lonely days. It gives her a place to be audacious in her questioning. It provides her a place to dream. Early, when young Estelle was still casting about in school, looking to find her path, she'd travel to the library to research what occupation, reporter, photographer, librarian, she might be best suited for, given her own skills, interests, strengths, and weaknesses. She didn't trust a school guidance counselor and the low expectations often doled out to her. Instead, she constructed lists, sitting at a table or in a carrel, examining job descriptions. What was doable with the sort of personality she had? Who could she be? The library might present her a glimpse of other possibilities. She was casting about in a way she did most everything. First, turn a harsh mirror to herself, then jump in the deep end, research and paddle about in the murk for a bit. Things will clarify. They always do, eventually. She works on her patience. In this sense, the library is her workshop of sorts, a place to close the door of the world and ask herself, what if? In clearest terms, her library card isn't just a lifeline, but lifeblood. She is practical and is wont to anthropomorphize or be overly sentimental. But it would not be a stretch to suggest that the library was a teacher and sounding board, and in moments, a confidant. She always arrives ready with questions. So many questions. It's too big a trip downtown to the big library, the Central Library in Los Angeles, not to have made plans. This is work too, the slow work of seeking and scanning. It's part of the writing process, pulsing deeply into matters.
It's so beautiful. I was just reminded suddenly as you read it that when August Wilson came to the library, he also pretty much the Pittsburgh Public Library was
That's
his
right.
teacher, because I think he either got bored with school or he dropped out of school and he just went to the library every day. And I mean, you're someone who's thought about serendipity a lot, so that and I was thinking, like, what if she were confined now to just Zoom? Like libraries aren't open, and that's those are the sacred, safe places. That it alarms me. There's that beautiful quote. I think I'll ask you this one last question, and then maybe we can take some questions from the audience too. There's that beautiful quote from Octavia: all that you touch, you change.
Mhm.
All that you change changes you. I mean, you know, the rest of it goes
Right.
on. And I was thinking, you worked so long at this and you project, and you've so immersed in this life, you know, of this very unique visionary artist. How has working in the archive and writing this book changed you, or would you say that it has it changed you? And if so, how?
Yes, it really has, and I think it's continuing to reveal itself. I was very early in all of this when I was doing the first conversations with people. I realized, like, Octavia really has been, in the last few months, we've been pod mates. Like, I've spent more time with Octavia than anyone talking. She's talking to me, and then last summer, we had those terrible fires and the heat waves, and I was reading Parable of the Talents, and I just thought, this is a little bit too on the nose, where this is just, everything is just, hellscape. I say this, though, because I think being in the archive, and it's so different than as a reporter. Like, what reporters want is access. When you're writing a big profile about someone, a big piece about someone, you want to be able to spend time, and you want them to feel comfortable around you enough to start revealing themselves. And the thing is, with this, I realized she would never, even if I had gained confidence with her, I would never have gotten to know someone quite like this, where you are in their heart, in their head, in their arm as they're writing. I'm looking over her shoulder, and there's something in inhabiting someone that way. And I know it will never happen again, not quite like this. And there's something, I feel like it's changed me, and I'm not quite sure yet how. But as I said, like, she was my pod mate, during this. So there was something too about, like, seeing her overcome really difficult periods, not a pandemic, but her life was really difficult. I thought, she can do it. I can do this. How do I organize my day so I'm not panicked? Because she was often dealing with anxiety. And so there's been those little things, but yeah, in larger ways, I'm not sure yet, but yes, absolutely. She's on my shoulder.
You met her, your mother took you to hear her when you were how old?
I was a teenager, probably. Mid to late teens, and
I
she took me
I
to a
love
reading.
that. I love that. I mean, I wonder if, and if Octavia, in a sense, anticipated you.
Mm,
I mean, I'm thinking you don't. I mean, you think it's quite extraordinary how many things she saved, right?
yes.
And there's a phrase in Yiddish. You talk about someone being a Sammler, a collector,
Mm,
and in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was this organization under this historian Simon Dubnow, who said collect everything. You
mm,
don't collect. They kept bus tickets, and they every little because, and the way you've mined the archive for
yes.
those to
Yes.
see a bus ticket, to see the library card in the book.
Yes.
I just love this. I think Angel City did such a gorgeous job of producing this book, and I love how it works for different ages and different
Yes.
levels. It's gonna be a classic, I think.
Yes.
So thank you for writing it, my dear.
Well,
It's a beautiful book.
I'm so glad that you took what you. It's always wonderful being in conversation with people to hear what they took away from it and how it has made them think about their own practice. Because that's the other thing. It's not just for writers. I think it's for any of us who are trying to do something that's difficult,
Yeah.
and you're trying to shore yourself up. And she did not have a lot. She had these humble objects. Yeah, her bus pass, her hand-me-down notebooks and diaries, all of her bills, her calendars, but all these things were the framework for her and the foundation for her to create this amazing life. And that's the thing I, also like to remember, is like, we want it to be perfect. I want to go away and, be on a writer's retreat. I'm stuck in my house because it's a pandemic. You can write in your house. So it's things, it's like remembering her voice, and like, no, this can get done,
It will also carry me. I just started tutoring through a program that's trying to help kids in LAUSD who are falling through the cracks. And I was assigned a fourth grader, and I had my first session, via Zoom. And she's trying to do her assignments on her mother's phone. She can't log into school. They're in one room with three people. They've all had COVID. And I'm thinking, like, here's this bright child, and like, how is,
Yeah.
how is she going to do it? And so it's great. It was great to go back to your book and just go like, well, how did Octavia do it? Yes, she had a ferocious will, a ferocious discipline.
Yes.
But maybe, you can help other people to, kind of feel like they can maybe do something impossible.
Right.
Clearly people are living in impossible
We
situations.
are, and it's really true. And also to know, and I think that was also key, is like, for her, she constantly had to, keep reminding herself, it wasn't a straight line, like she would cave, she would have a bad day, she would have a bad month. She went 5 years without publishing something, between thinking like she was going to go here, and then it went like this. And to me, that it had to have been one of the hardest periods, because you're like, was it a fluke?
Right.
So I think about that too, that like, it's that reminder, like, it's not a straight line either, that it's gonna be good, and then you're gonna hit a bump, and it's how you recover from that bump, and the spill, and how you brush yourself off. So yeah, she's quite a role model,
Yeah, we have to have some of that Octavia tonic,
Yes, exactly.
Kevin, we're gonna bring you back so we can have some of these questions that are piling up there. I can see.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm just focused on this ferocious will comment. I love that idea, and you can see that in your conversation about how she persevered. Right, she just did her thing and kept doing her thing, and it was amazing. So first, I just want to say thank you to both of you for this interesting conversation. So fascinating, this discussion about a dynamic person that I think a lot of people at the book club or on this presentation don't know that much about. And you gave us a nice glimpse into her life. And hopefully that's an impetus for people to go buy the book, right? I put the link to the book up in the chat for people who are interested in checking that out. But Octavia E. Butler is so complex of an individual. There's only so much we could get done in a 40-minute conversation, but the whole idea of how forward-thinking she is, and so extraordinary as a person, given all of the challenges that she's had. We have some great questions that I'm just gonna kind of throw out at you if you haven't already peeked at the Q&A or the chat. So the one question, which is one I had for myself, is why did Octavia Butler choose science fiction as the vehicle to write about human relations, which this participant says is the essence of her literary contributions? Like, what drew her into that science fiction field?
She felt it would allow her to write about anything she wanted, because it literally, for her, it moved the walls and the ceiling and the floor out. Because as a child growing up, she said, and she writes a lot about power, and she said, I wanted to do this because I needed to write myself in. I needed to find a place where I could write about women and people of color, Black people in particular, and give them power and play with time. And even though she would say later, I don't consider everything I do science fiction, at least the genre gave her room to move things around and say, no, this is my universe. This is my world. This is how I'm going to do it. And it gives me space.
It also reminds me, in that podcast you referred me to, Lynell, maybe we can put the that link too in the chat. I think it's Greg Tate who says, thinking about Kindred, her novel Kindred, like, what is more science fiction than slavery? Like you've brought, you've been taken to like another planet, you've been what you knew was taken away from you in a way. So as she, when she talks about the past and the present, being existing simultaneous, out of that, she makes what we call science fiction,
Right.
but there's other words for it as well. I mean,
She calls it a grim fantasy, and she also, she said, think about it, history can be a planet, so, and she'll say, there's no science in Kindred. There's no machine, there's, the protagonist, Dana, is just snatched in and out of time. And the thing that got me about it, rereading it recently too, is that, and of course, we're still dealing with this wound of slavery in present day. So yeah, it's on the same continuum. So of course, we're snatched back and forth.
Mhm.
So yeah, so it gave her leeway to do the things she wanted to do and write about, humans.
So there's a comment here, because you're talking about protagonists and Black female characters. There's a great comment in the chat about that, says, besides being wonderful protagonists, her characters, especially her Black female characters, have to me a messianic quality.
Mm-hmm.
Do her diaries speak to that as part of her intention for the central character? Like, was that, how purposeful is that? And did you come across that in your research?
Absolutely, especially in terms of creating herself. Absolutely. There's a moment in the journals where she is fighting so hard with herself. She's extremely vicious sometimes with herself. But she realized, in order to go forward, in order to not be this shy person, Estelle, that's it. She was known, both her mother and Octavia, they were both Octavias. And Octavia E, Estelle Butler, the child, and Octavia Margaret. And so she was known in the family as Estelle, Estella, or Junie, because that was her birth month, was June. But at a certain point, she decided, this shy, retreating girl that's too afraid to go outside and talk to people out loud, I have to figure out some way to be something more than that. So she actually sat in her journals and wrote Octavia and Estelle, and she started to dream, like, Octavia will be the one who will wear high heels and be 6 foot tall and wear high heels anyway. Octavia will be the one that will go and have no problem talking to people. Octavia will be the one that will go on book tour, and that will, and it really became, she had to write herself in as a character. And so you see so much of this mapping, in the journals, where she's gathering her force and figuring out who she's connecting with. And you see that in the letters too, sometimes, if she's writing to younger writers later, about finding their inner power.
People, I think, are fascinated with the journals. All you've said about the journals and walking journals, and she wrote lists and letters. There's such a wealth of information there that's sitting there in the archive. There is a great question about you working with the archive at the Huntington, and were there any like Eureka moments during your research where you came across something, or like mind blown, right? Or like, oh my God, this was such an incredible find in the archive that you could share with us?
I'm trying to think. There's so many. I don't know if I had a Eureka moment, but I kept feeling like the way she would reveal herself, in the archive, like when she was really young, because she was living in such close quarters with everyone, she wanted, and she was keeping these journals, and she wanted to keep her secrets. There are parts of her journals that are written in Spanish. I had no idea. I mean, because she was taking Spanish at the time. So she would write pages and pages, and I was like, oh my gosh. But it also revealed too how important, in that, for example, this idea of languages and
Mhm.
looking at larger worlds, and she was interested in anthropology, and she was interested in traveling, which she did do later in her life. But you see seeds of things like that really early, and like her curiosities were so large. And I'm trying to think if there's any, I'll probably, when we're done, I'll have one of those, like, of course, that one. But there were things like that really like struck me, at a very early age. She,
Mhm.
was shape-shifting.
So how long did you work on the book? How long were you in the archives? How many months, years?
I was in the archive on and off, for 4 years, and because I'm a freelancer, so when I would have pockets of time, I would go a lot, and then it might be once a week, or it might be, but all told, to do two separate pieces, it was 4 years.
Mhm.
Lynell, there's a interesting question. I don't know the answer to this. Did Octavia know Ray Bradbury?
She mentions him, but I have not found any evidence in the archive that they met. And it was funny because I wanted to know too, because they both went to the library. They were like LA library,
Right.
people, and they both didn't drive. And I used to work in a bookstore in Century City near where he lived, and he used to bike to our bookstore and we would let him bring his bike inside and lean it on it against the shelves. And I loved interacting with him. He was wonderful. But I know she liked his work, but I don't know if they ever met.
Yeah, Lynell, thanks for sharing that. And Louise, thanks for finding that comment there in the chat. We were going to get to that. There's a couple other names dropped in that same comment. Harlan Ellison,
yes,
for example, as a mentor.
Yes.
And I think the bigger question is, what were her other connections in the science fiction community and the writer community that came
Harlan,
out?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
The Harlan Ellison connection is a really important one. One of the early steps she took here in Los Angeles was to involve herself in a program called the Open Door Program. And it was for minorities, in the arts. So playwrights and science fiction writers, and it was hosted by the Writers Guild. And so she signed up for this program, and she met a bunch of people, and Harlan Ellison was handling one of the workshops that she was in, and she impressed him with her work. And he's the one that suggested that she go to Clarion, which was this science fiction workshop in Pennsylvania. She had never been anywhere away from home, and she could not afford it. And he said, well, if I can come up with half of it, you should go. And she hemmed and hawed because she was afraid. And he gave her the money. She got on the Greyhound bus, and she took that bus across the country. And that's where she met Samuel Delaney, who became a teacher and then later a friend. And those connections, that serendipity, that's what opened up her world. She was finally around people who understood what she wanted to do, even though, once again, she was the only Black person, certainly the only Black woman. But I think all of her training of being quiet and the only one as a very young person helped her survive this and pushed her forward. But yes, so that was a really important moment for her, to be in that world.
Right. There are a couple of specific questions, like where is she buried in Southern California?
She's at Mountain View Cemetery, which is here in Altadena, California.
And I want to know the answer to what someone wrote. What was Octavia Butler's relationship with drug?
With what?
So, what was she interested in psychedelics, part of her creative or spiritual development? It says her books have such a psychedelic sensibility, but also offer caution, which is a good observation.
I saw no evidence of that in anything I looked at. That does not mean it doesn't exist. It just means
Did she
it
read
didn't pass through my hands. It just, and that's a really good question because yes, but her imagination was so there. Also, I mean, I think about like the lack of sleep she had. I often wonder, like, did some of this come from just like,
and also she had to work these, I mean, she worked so many, you know, crummy jobs. I mean, she had
and went
to,
to school full time at the
yeah.
same time?
Do you know if she read Aldous Huxley, or what, if she was interested in his?
You know, I should look through the photographs I have of her call slips because I don't remember. She read a lot of, well, she read everything, you
Yeah,
know,
she read,
so I wouldn't, I mean, probably, you know.
because also he was here
Yeah,
in LA,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I wonder
Yeah.
if she drew on that community of kind of seekers, but it was also pretty white, that world.
Right. But she, I mean, again, she read what was there and that was, and what she could access. And if she was curious about it, it didn't matter.
What was, and I don't think you mentioned it specifically, what was her education? Like, where did she go to school? We talked a little bit about, you know, the whole idea of what her job would be, you know,
Right,
that whole
right.
process, which was great, but what was her schooling like?
She, when she finished high school here at Muir in Pasadena, she went to Pasadena City College for a couple of years. She got her AA. She went to Cal State LA. She started studying there, but she was frustrated because she was looking for a writing program, specifically, you know, fiction. That wasn't there. She found journalism, and she decided that, like, she was like, I can't do that, you know, because I'm too timid. I can't imagine being a reporter. And I'm sitting here going, yes, you could. You know how to research. You know how to ask really good questions, but she was just so withdrawn. So she left there and she did some UCLA extension programs. But after that, she just thought, I have to figure out how I'm going to do this because no one else is going to teach me. And so she just self-educated herself from then on.
I wish I could have had a
that seems to
conversation with her and August Wilson at the library.
Oh my God, that would have been such a great evening.
That would have been good. That would have been good. Also, because he was so self-educated in the library.
Yes, in the library, exactly, same path.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there's that great story about when she's trying to figure out some of this, where she's really frustrated because she doesn't even know how to submit a manuscript. And she's pulling her hair out about it. And she gets on the bus one day, and there is a copy of the Writer magazine sitting on a bus seat. And she's like, oh my God, look at this. It's as if it was waiting for her. And that made her know, I can go to the library and find more of these. And that's actually what helped her figure out how to write a cover letter, how to write a query, how to even format a page. So she found things like this. And there's this beautiful letter that she wrote years later that they published in the magazine, where she thanks, you know, this moment of chance and in the magazine for helping her become a writer, like, you know, becoming a professional writer, because she found this magazine on the bus seat. And it's just beautiful. And she of course saved the magazine and the letter. And it was in there too.
That story gives me goosebumps. It just
Yeah.
really is pretty great.
Yeah.
Great.
So we're just at the top of the hour, but there's one more question that I'm going to get in here before we wrap up a little bit. And it's more about her artistic community. Were there any visual artists that she was interested in? Just an interesting question.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if there's someone she was in communication with. She was really interested in photography to the point where she did finally buy a camera. And there are hundreds of photographs of hers that she shot on her travels, in life, documentary photographs. She was developing that side of herself as well. And if I have, once I can get back into the archive, I really want to spend some more time with that, because I didn't, because I had to keep going, because as Louise knows, that's one of the things that I'm also obsessed with. I just had to keep like pulling myself away. But I cannot think off the top of my head if there was someone she was close to. She described herself, I'm a hermit in the middle of Los Angeles. She did not go out a lot. She did not do things. This isn't to say that she didn't go to the theater. She didn't go to readings. She did socialize. She did have a small community, but it was limited. She was very focused on her work.
And survival.
Yeah.
Took a lot of her energy.
Yeah.
So much. Yeah.
Another major theme that keeps coming out is she's always developing herself, right? The whole idea of possibilities and the what if on herself, right? Like, what if I did this, and how do I remake myself or make this happen? There was one other question. I know I said no more questions, but there's one that was in the chat and I can't find it anymore. Because I thought it was super interesting. Someone asked, are there any like audio recordings or videos of her presentations that people can find? Because you mentioned she was so shy, but then you also said she did speeches, right? She was flown around, and
she forced herself into, and like, so to see these, and they're on YouTube, and there's so many, and they're so good, and you should watch as many as you can.
All of them.
All of them. Spend the day. No, she was really, and it's like in watching them, you would not know. But then when I would read the journals afterward, she was innervated because as an introvert, she had like spent everything, and she would say, I'm just peopled out. I can't do this. But she was so afraid. And she signed up for classes, she took John Robert Powers classes because she wanted to learn poise, and she wanted to, because she goes, I have no idea really what I'm looking for. But again, as you were saying, she kept trying to push, to develop herself. And it's amazing. I highly recommend watching the Charlie Rose interview where there doesn't seem to be any sense of any nervousness in her, at all. But she was.
Yeah.
She was.
Love it.
But it's like her authority is what you see, like, I'm not messing with this woman.
That was Octavia, not Estelle.
Yes, it was Octavia.
Right. That she created for herself. Yeah. So such a fascinating person. And some of the things that you talked about, I'm going to get those links and those resources and put them in the email that we'll send out to everybody who came tonight. So you can go find those, like how to find the book. We'll try to find the podcast link that you're talking about, and the Charlie Rose interview. Now I want to see that. So I'm going to have to find that anyway. I'll put that in the email that goes out to everyone. This was so fascinating. I mean, I am so interested now in diving into this book, and I'm sure many of our participants who were on this call are interested in doing that as well. You guys were so engaging in conversation, and I love that you love Octavia E. Butler so much to just keep talking about her all night.
We probably could.
Yeah. That's my fear. We could be here all night just talking about, now I want to talk more about her too. So, but we'll have to put a pin in that and have you back another time to talk more about her. So thank you. Thank you, Lynell. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Lynell. Thank you, Kevin.
Terrific job.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for such a great questions. It was really a great.
Yes. Thank you, everyone who came, and for those great questions. Thanks for attending this Book Club of California program. We're so glad you were here. Please join us for our next online program, Corita Kent, Art and Soul, the biography. It's going to be next Monday, 2 Mondays from now, not next Monday, the Monday after that, March 8th, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. It's going to be a live online presentation by April Damon, author. I think she's actually participating in this presentation now, listening to you guys. So come back in 2 weeks for April's presentation. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that we send out to you from the book club. So thank you again, Lynell. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I look forward to talking to you both again. Everyone, be well and take care of yourself.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.